Chapter 1. The proposal that shocked the world. It started as a joke, or did it? It was August 2019 when President Donald Trump asked a question that no one expected. Can we buy Greenland? A few chuckles. A pause. Then silence. The room full of top officials stared at each other. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted in their seat. He wasn't joking. Greenland, a vast icy island in the North Atlantic, a place of glaciers, polar bears, and a small population of 56,000 people. It was controlled by Denmark, but had its own government. No one had ever suggested buying it, not in modern history. But Trump saw an opportunity, a land of ice. But underneath, resources, gold, oil, rare minerals. A land of strategic power sitting between Russia, North America, and Europe. A land that, once before, had been offered for sale by the U.S. back in 1946. But that was long ago. This was different. The news leaked. Headlines exploded. Trump wants to buy Greenland. The world was listening. And soon, the world was reacting. The Danish government was the first to respond. This must be a joke, said politicians in Copenhagen. Greenland is not for sale, said Denmark's Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen. She looked serious. She sounded insulted. Trump was not pleased. It was a big idea, he later told reporters. A great idea. Denmark should have at least considered it. He waited for a reply. Instead, the Prime Minister called his plan absurd. Absurd? That word echoed in Trump's mind. In front of cameras, he fumed. Nasty, he called Frederiksen's reaction. He canceled his state visit to Denmark, a visit that had been planned for months. Now it was gone. Denmark was stunned. The European Union watched in shock. The U.S. and Denmark were allies. But now things were tense. It seemed like a joke. But it wasn't. And that's what made it so unbelievable. Across the ocean, in Greenland, the people were confused. What did this mean for them? Their land? Their homes? Their future? A woman in Nuuk, the capital, shook her head when a journalist asked her. Greenland is not something you buy, she said. But others were curious. What if the U.S. did buy Greenland? Would there be money? Would there be opportunity? Or would Greenland lose its identity? The debate had begun. But Greenlanders had already made up their minds. The answer was no. Not everyone in Washington agreed with Trump. Some laughed. Some thought it was ridiculous. But others saw what Trump saw. The Arctic, the ice was melting, And beneath it? Oil, gold, rare earth minerals, things that made China powerful, things that made Russia dangerous. And Greenland? Greenland had them all. The United States military had been in Greenland for decades. The Thule Air Base, America's northernmost military base, was already there. The U.S. was watching. So were other world powers. Trump understood something. Whoever controlled Greenland controlled the future. The world was laughing. Late-night talk shows made jokes. Newspapers called it a real estate fantasy. But then, something happened. The laughter stopped. In China, government officials held meetings. They were already investing in Greenland. Quietly, in ports, in mines. They wanted Greenland's minerals. In Russia, Arctic military operations increased. Submarines moved, bases expanded. They wanted control. And the United States? Trump's Greenland idea had failed. But he had revealed something. A battle was already happening. A battle for the Arctic. And Greenland was the key. The deal was dead. But the fight for Greenland? That had just begun. Chapter 2. Why Greenland? The strategic and economic importance. Was Greenland just another real estate deal, or something much bigger? Greenland, a land of ice and silence. To most, it was just a cold island, remote, empty, a place few people ever thought about. But to world leaders, to the most powerful nations on Earth, Greenland was a treasure. Not because of its beauty, not because of its small towns or northern lights, because of what lay beneath, because of its location, because of its future. The Arctic was changing, melting. The ice that had covered Greenland for thousands of years was shrinking. And underneath, a hidden world. Oil, gas, rare minerals, elements needed for the future. Smartphones, electric cars, satellites, all depended on materials buried deep under Greenland's frozen land. And now, those resources were becoming easier to reach. Nations were watching. The race for Greenland had begun. But it wasn't just about money. It was about power. Greenland was more than an island. It was a bridge between North America, Europe, and Russia. A place where ships could pass, where military bases could rise, where nations could gain an advantage. And the U.S.? The U.S. already had its foot in the door. The Thule Air Base, built during the Cold War, sat in the icy north. It was a listening post, a watchtower in the Arctic, missiles, radars, a shield against enemies. For the United States, Greenland was not just valuable. It was necessary. Trump saw it. Others saw it too. And that's when the fight for Greenland truly began. In Washington, Trump's advisors whispered about the possibilities. Could Greenland be bought? Could America own this frozen frontier? It sounded strange, impossible. But there was history. In 1946, the U.S. had already tried to buy Greenland. Back then, President Harry Truman had offered $100 million for the island. Denmark had said no. But times had changed. The Arctic had never been more important. China was moving in, trying to build airports. Russia was strengthening its Arctic fleet. Trump didn't want to be left behind. He wanted to own the future. The problem? Denmark wasn't selling. The Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, was clear. Greenland is not for sale. This is not how the world works anymore. But Trump didn't give up. He had bought hotels, casinos, skyscrapers. To him, everything had a price. Why not Greenland? Denmark was small. The U.S. was powerful. Could they be convinced? Could they be pressured? Trump thought so. But what he didn't expect was the reaction. Untitled. The news spread. Greenland. A place few had thought about was now in the headlines. Leaders across Europe were shocked. Was this a joke? They asked. Or was it something more? The Arctic was no longer a frozen, forgotten place. It was now the center of the world's attention. And some countries? They saw an opportunity. China had been quiet. But in the shadows, they had plans. Chinese companies were investing in Greenland's mining industry. They wanted the rare minerals buried in the ice. They had tried to build airports on the island. A small investment? Or something bigger? The U.S. saw it as a threat. Trump saw it as a challenge. If China was interested in Greenland, then the U.S. needed to move fast. Russia was watching too. For years, they had been expanding their Arctic power, building new military bases, strengthening their navy. They wanted to control Arctic shipping routes, to dominate the frozen seas, to keep other nations out. Greenland? To them, it was just another piece of the Arctic puzzle. And if the U.S. wanted it, Russia would make sure it wouldn't be so easy. Trump's idea had started as a whisper. But now it was a storm. Denmark was furious. Greenland's leaders were rejecting the idea. Europe was against it. China and Russia were quietly making their own moves. And America? America had been pushed into the Arctic game. A game of resources. A game of power. A game that was only just beginning. And the biggest question of all? Who would win? Chapter 3. Denmark's Furious Response. Greenland is not for sale. The reaction came fast. Denmark was furious. When the news broke that Trump wanted to buy Greenland, Danish officials didn't laugh. They didn't smile. They were shocked. "This must be a joke," one Danish politician said, but it wasn't. It was serious. And the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, had something to say. She stood before the cameras, her face calm but firm. "Greenland belongs to Greenland," she said. "This is not a real estate deal." Her voice was steady, but her words were sharp. She didn't just reject the idea. She crushed it. Greenland was not something to sell. It was not property. It was a nation, a land with people, culture, history. To Denmark, this was not business. This was an insult. Trump heard her words, and he was not happy. Nasty, he called her. A single word, but it carried weight. Denmark was one of America's closest allies. They had fought together in wars. They had stood side by side in NATO. And now, a single deal, or the rejection of one, was changing everything. Trump had planned a trip to Denmark, a state visit, a meeting of leaders. But now it was canceled, untitled. The world was watching. Could a simple idea, a conversation about Greenland, turn into a diplomatic crisis? It seemed impossible. But it was happening. In Denmark, the reaction wasn't just political, it was personal. The Danish people were offended. Newspapers wrote angry headlines. Citizens called it ridiculous. Political leaders called it offensive. Even Greenland's own leaders spoke out. "We are not a product," one Greenlandic official said. "We are a people." The message was clear. The answer was no. Trump, however, didn't give up easily. He believed in negotiation. He believed in deals. But this wasn't real estate. It wasn't a hotel, a casino, or a skyscraper. It was a country. And a country couldn't be bought. Or could it? Not everyone in the U.S. government thought Trump was wrong. Some saw logic in the idea. Greenland had strategic importance. The U.S. already had a military base there. Why not own the land? Why not make Greenland American? It wasn't the first time the U.S. had tried. Back in 1946, President Harry Truman had offered $100 million for Greenland. Denmark had said no then, and they were saying no now. Still, the anger in Denmark was stronger than expected. This was not just politics. It was pride. Denmark had a long history of colonization. Centuries ago, they had controlled Iceland, Norway, Greenland, and more. But times had changed. people fought for independence. And Greenland? Greenland was on that path. It had its own government. It made its own decisions. Selling it would mean turning back time. It would mean ignoring history. And that was something Denmark would never do. Trump didn't let go of ideas easily. He had built his career on bold moves, on pushing until he got what he wanted. Would this be different? He called Denmark's reaction rude. He said they should have talked first, considered it, negotiated. But to Denmark, there was nothing to discuss. No matter how much money the U.S. offered, Greenland was not for sale. As the days passed, the tension grew. What had started as a business question had turned into a global debate. Was Trump's request outrageous, or was it just ahead of its time? The Arctic was changing. New opportunities were opening. China was moving in. Russia was building military bases. The U.S. had to act fast. Trump believed he had the answer. But Denmark? Denmark had spoken, and their answer was final. For the first time in years, tensions between the U.S. and Denmark were high. It seemed unbelievable. These two nations had been friends for centuries. And now one question, one idea, had pushed them apart. A question that had started as a whisper. A question that had echoed around the world. And a question that in the end had no deal, but left behind a storm. Chapter 4. European leaders enter the debate. Trump had a vision, but the world had other plans. The shock spread beyond Denmark. Europe was listening, and they were not pleased. Greenland was not just an island. It was part of the Western Alliance, part of NATO, part of Europe's security. Trump's offer felt like a threat, not just to Denmark, but to all of them. The reaction was fast and sharp. France called the idea disrespectful. Germany warned of dangerous geopolitics. NATO leaders raised concerns. Would the U.S. buy other territories next? Was this the beginning of something bigger? Questions filled the air. Allies were confused. Was this real diplomacy or just another bold statement? Trump's words had caused a storm that no one had seen coming. Some European leaders laughed at first. Impossible, they said. But soon they realized this was not a joke. The U.S. was serious, and that changed everything. Untitled. For decades, the Arctic had been ignored, frozen, silent, forgotten. Now the world was waking up. And Greenland? It was at the center of it all. This wasn't just about Trump. It was about power. It was about who controlled the future. And Europe? Europe didn't want to be left behind. Behind closed doors, leaders gathered. In Berlin, in Paris, in Brussels. The European Union held emergency talks. Would the U.S. push further? Would Denmark need support? For the first time, the Arctic was on everyone's agenda. Europe had to make a stand. But against whom? Trump? Or something bigger? Tensions grew. Even in Washington, some officials felt uneasy. This wasn't just about buying land. It was about America's image. Some in Trump's own government had doubts. Would this make the U.S. look aggressive? Would it damage alliances? There was no clear answer. But one thing was certain. America's rivals were watching. From Moscow to Beijing, eyes turned north. Russia had long expanded in the Arctic. Military bases, icebreaker ships, influence. And China? China was investing. Quietly, carefully, building trade routes, mining contracts. Was Trump's idea a mistake, or was it a warning? Europe had to decide. Would they stay silent, or would they act? In the halls of the United Nations, whispers spread. Would America force the issue? Would Trump pressure Denmark? Would Greenland become a battleground? No one knew. But Europe would not wait to find out. A new plan was taking shape. Stronger Arctic policies. Closer ties with Greenland. A clear message to the U.S. Greenland was off limits. Europe would stand by Denmark. The Arctic would not be a place for bidding wars. This was about sovereignty, and Europe was ready to defend it. The U.S. had miscalculated. Trump had pushed too far. What he saw as a deal, the world saw as a threat. Greenland was no longer just ice and land. It was a symbol of something bigger. Power, influence, control. The Arctic's future was no longer a question. It was a fight. And everyone was now part of it. Chapter 5. The Military and Security Implications. The Arctic is melting, and so is the balance of power. The world was changing. Not just in politics, not just in trade, but in nature itself. The Arctic, once locked in ice and silence, was opening. And with it came a battle for control. This wasn't just about Greenland anymore. It was about the entire Arctic, a frozen frontier where nations clashed without firing a single shot. The ice was retreating, and underneath, new pathways, New opportunities, new risks. Superpowers were moving in. Russia, China, the United States, all watching, all waiting. Russia was ahead of the game. For years, they had been preparing, building military bases on Arctic islands, expanding their naval forces, testing new weapons in frozen waters. The world had ignored it. Now it was impossible to ignore. Russia wasn't just claiming the Arctic, they were owning it. China had a different plan. No warships, no military bases, but money. They were investing in Greenland, trying to buy influence, building airports, funding mining operations, securing access to rare minerals, materials needed for technology, batteries, weapons. China didn't need to own Greenland. They just needed a foot in the door, and they were getting closer every year. The United States? They were falling behind. Yes, they had Thule Air Base, a military outpost high in the Arctic. But was it enough? Russia had icebreakers. China had economic power. And America? America was watching from the sidelines. Trump wanted to change that. He saw Greenland as a way to catch up, to secure America's future, to make sure the U.S. wasn't just a spectator in the Arctic race, untitled. For centuries, Greenland had been quiet, a land of ice, a place of hunters, fishermen, small villages. But now? Now it was at the center of global conflict. And the people who lived there? They had a voice, and they were ready to use it. The people of Greenland had watched the news. They had heard Trump's plan. They had listened to Denmark's response. But what did they want? Did they see a future with the United States? Or were they afraid of what would happen next? A fisherman in Nuuk, Greenland's capital, shook his head. We are not American. We are not Danish. We are Greenlandic. It was their land, their home, and they wanted to decide their own future. Greenland's leaders made their position clear. They were not for sale. They were not a bargaining chip. For years, Greenland had been moving toward independence from Denmark. Would selling it to the U.S. erase that progress? Would it mean losing control of their own destiny? These were the questions that worried the people. Not money, not politics, but their identity. Yet the world wasn't waiting for Greenland to decide. Superpowers were closing in. Ships in Arctic waters. Spies gathering information. Secret meetings behind closed doors. Would Greenland become a battleground? Would nations fight over it? Or would they find a way to share its future? No one knew. But one thing was certain. Greenland was no longer just an island of ice. It was the key to something bigger. Power. resources, survival, and the battle for the Arctic had only just begun. Chapter 6. Greenland's Leaders Speak Out. We are not for sale. We are not a commodity. Greenland was not empty. It was not just ice. It was home. For over 56,000 people, Greenland was more than a frozen land. It was a place of history, language, and culture. A place of hunters and fishermen. A land of pride. And when the world talked about buying it, Greenlanders had something to say. Trump's proposal had shocked the world. But in Greenland, it had angered them. Their leaders stood before the world and spoke clearly. We are not part of a business transaction. They had spent years fighting for independence from Denmark, not to be sold, not to be owned. They wanted freedom, not a new flag, not a new government, not a new master. The backlash was immediate. Greenlanders feared what would happen if the U.S. took control. Would their language be lost? Would their way of life disappear? Would their resources be taken without their consent? These questions spread across the island, and the answer from Greenland's people was clear. No. Loudly, fiercely, with no room for negotiation, but in the shadows. There were others watching. Trump wasn't the only one interested in Greenland. Two giants had their eyes on it: China, Russia. And they weren't making headlines. They were making moves. Untitled. For years, China had been investing in Greenland, not by sending troops, not by offering to buy it, but by slowly building influence. They had tried to fund airports, tried to gain access to Greenland's rare minerals, tried to secure a future in the Arctic without anyone noticing. To Greenland, this was another threat. Were they just a tool for other nations? Would China own them in a different way? Would they trade one powerful nation for another? The fear was growing. And Russia? Russia wasn't using money. They were using strength. For years, they had been expanding their Arctic bases, building more icebreakers than any other nation, testing new weapons in the frozen sea. To them, Greenland wasn't just an island. It was a doorway, a way to control Arctic shipping routes, a way to increase their power, a way to keep the U.S. out. And if America couldn't buy Greenland, Russia would make sure they couldn't own it in any way. The tension was rising. Greenland was caught in the middle, between the United States, China, and Russia. 3 superpowers, 3 different plans, and one small island trying to survive. Would they be able to stay independent? Or was their future already decided by bigger forces? No one knew. But the pressure was growing. In Nuuk, Greenland's capital, leaders gathered. The Prime Minister stood before her people. She spoke with determination. We decide our own future, not America, not China, not Russia, us. The crowd cheered. But deep inside, there was fear. Would these superpowers accept Greenland's decision? Would they back away? Or would they push harder? The world was changing fast. Greenland had stood its ground, but the storm was not over yet. Chapter 7. China and Russia, the hidden players. The world was distracted, but they were making their move. While headlines focused on Trump, while Europe debated, while Greenlanders protested, two giants watched in silence. China, a master of slow, careful moves. Russia, a force that had been preparing for years. They saw what others didn't. They saw an opportunity, and they were ready to take it. Greenland had always been quiet, a land of ice, snow, and small villages. But beneath that ice, beneath that silence, there was wealth and power, resources the world needed, rare minerals, oil, a strategic location in the heart of the Arctic. And now? Now, it was a prize, and every superpower wanted a piece of it. China moved first. They didn't send troops. They didn't send warships. They sent money, a slow, quiet investment. They tried to fund Greenland's airports, tried to build partnerships, tried to win trust without raising alarms. But some people noticed. In Washington, officials grew concerned. Why was China interested in Greenland? What was their real goal? The answer was obvious. Control, influence, a foothold in the Arctic. Russia moved differently. They didn't need money. They already had something stronger. They had military power. For years, they had been expanding, building new Arctic bases, testing weapons in the frozen sea, launching submarines beneath the ice. They weren't buying Greenland, but they were making sure no one else could have it. If the Arctic became a battlefield, Russia would be ready. Untitled. For a long time, the Arctic had been forgotten. A frozen world. A place of polar bears and glaciers. But now? Now it was the future. The ice was melting. New shipping routes were opening. New resources were becoming available. And whoever controlled the Arctic controlled the next century. Trump's Greenland bid had done something unexpected. it had shaken the world awake. Countries that had ignored Greenland were now paying attention. China, Russia, even European nations. Greenland was no longer just a piece of Denmark. It was a global asset, and the competition had only just begun. In Greenland, people watched with unease. First, the U.S. wanted to buy them. Now, China and Russia were making moves. What did it mean for them? Would their home become a battleground? Would they lose control? Would they have to choose a side? Fear spread. Whispers of foreign influence. Warnings of future conflict. Greenland wanted to be independent. But was that even possible? China wasn't backing down. They had lost the airport deal. But they had other plans. They still had mining investments, still had connections with Greenlandic businesses. A slow game. A patient game. China was good at waiting. And when the moment was right, they would strike again. Russia kept growing stronger. Satellite images showed new military bases in the Arctic, more submarines, more warships, more tensions. They had no interest in buying Greenland, but they had every interest in controlling the Arctic, and they were getting closer. In Washington, the mood had changed. At first, Greenland was just a real estate idea. Now it was a security threat. Now it was about more than Trump's vision. Now it was about global power. If China got too much influence, if Russia grew too strong, what would happen next? Would America be too late? The game had started. Greenland was in the middle. Superpowers were closing in. And the question was no longer if Greenland mattered. It was who would control it first. Chapter 9. A deal that never happened, but changed everything. Greenland wasn't sold, but the world would never be the same. The idea had come fast. It had shaken nations. It had sparked debates, created tensions, and made headlines across the world. But in the end, Greenland remained unchanged, at least on the surface. Trump had failed to buy it. Denmark had refused. Greenland had stood firm. No money had been exchanged. No contracts had been signed. The map of the world had not shifted, but something else had. Something deeper. Something that would last. The world had woken up. Before Trump's bid, few people had thought about Greenland's role in global power. Few had considered its true value. Few had seen what was coming next. But now the Arctic was on everyone's mind. Now, it was a battleground for influence. And now, the world was moving faster than ever before. The U.S. had learned a lesson. If it couldn't buy Greenland, it had to secure its place in the Arctic another way. Military bases, diplomatic ties, scientific research stations. Washington increased investments. The Arctic was no longer just ice and snow. It was a frontier, a place of competition, and the U.S. was determined not to fall behind. Russia had seen an opportunity. They had been expanding for years, building bases, deploying submarines, testing weapons. Trump's bid had made them move even faster. If America was serious about the Arctic, Russia had to be one step ahead. More ships, more troops, more control. The ice was melting, and Russia was staking its claim. China had adjusted its strategy. They had tried to invest in Greenland quietly. Now, the world was watching. Now, they had to be careful. But they were patient. They still wanted access to Greenland's rare minerals. Still wanted to influence its future. So they took a different path. More trade agreements, more silent partnerships, no sudden moves, just waiting for the right moment, for their turn to act. Untitled, in Nuuk, Greenland's capital, life continued. Fishermen went to sea. Children played in the snow. But something felt different. They were no longer just a small island in the north. They were a prize, and powerful nations were watching them closely. Would Greenland remain independent? Would they be forced to choose a side? No one knew. But the future felt uncertain. Denmark had won the argument. They had protected Greenland's sovereignty. They had kept their land, their people, their dignity. And yet, they felt the change too. Greenland was moving closer to independence. It was no longer just a distant territory. It was a rising power in the Arctic. Would Denmark be able to hold on? Or was Greenland's future heading in a new direction? The answer was coming soon. And Trump? He had moved on. The world had laughed at his idea, mocked him, dismissed him. But years later, some began to wonder, had he been wrong? Or had he seen something no one else did? The Arctic was becoming the new frontier. Superpowers were racing for control. And Greenland? Greenland was at the center of it all. Maybe, just maybe, Trump had been ahead of his time.